Well, welcome to everyone. My name is Matt Morningstar. I am counsel at Morgan Stanley, but I'm here today as co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the New York City Bar, along with Robert Marchman, my co-chair of that committee. That committee, along with the Council on the Profession, and in particular, Rhonda Singer, Judge Elizabeth Stong, and Kaylin Whittingham from the Council, the five of us have worked to put together what we really believe and are excited about is going to be a really dynamic conversation over the next hour or so on not losing sight of the incredibly important goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion during the age of COVID. It has been a challenging time for obviously the entire planet, but in particular for the profession. And Robert and I, from the Diversity Committee, were having a conversation around this, and we came to learn that the Council on the Profession was too. And so we joined forces and started to brainstorm this conversation. In those intervening weeks, the murder of Mr. Floyd occurred, and we obviously saw the rebirth of activism, of focus, of attention on critical issues of inequity in the United States. And so this is obviously all sort of dovetailed or all crashed together in the moment that we now find ourselves. You know, I'm reminded today, you know, basically as we speak, that Congressman Lewis is being laid to rest. A moment that I know we all pause on and reflect upon his legacy, but in doing so, how can we carry his legacy forward? And so with that, let me do a very quick introduction of a really amazing panel. Thank you to all of them for agreeing in basically short order to join us for the next hour or so and offer their insights. This panel would not be in existence without them, so thank you to all of them. As our moderator today, we have Sandra Yamate, who is the CEO of the Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Profession. And for our panelists, and I will do it in the order on my Brady Bunch screen here. First, we have Joel Stern, who is the CEO of the National Association of Minority and Women-Owned Law Firms. Second, we have Zach Carter, who, among a number of other things, has been the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, as well as New York City's Corporation Counsel, the city's lawyer. Maria Melendez, who is the Global Chief Diversity Officer for the Sidley Austin firm. Prior to that was a partner at Sidley as well, focusing on litigation and regulatory enforcement matters. And then last but certainly not least, Ricardo Anzaldua, who is now the General Counsel of Freddie Mac, but many have known in some of his other roles, and like Joel and Sandra and Maria and Zach, is a longtime proponent and advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the profession. So again, thank you all. To everyone who's on the webinar, thank you. A slight programming note, there is a Q&A function at the bottom. We welcome those questions. Please send them in fast and furious. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague and our chair for today, our moderator for the day, Sandra Yamate.
Thanks so much, Matt. And yes, we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can, but there's a lot of material to cover, and we have some amazing individuals here to share their perspectives. So let's get started. And let's begin by maybe focusing on spring 2020, which I think was unlike anything any of us could have envisioned. The media was full of stories about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it impacted communities of color. How has it impacted the legal profession and lawyers of color and other diverse lawyers? I'll call on people if you don't respond.
This is Ricardo Anzaldua. Thank you, Sandra. You know, obviously the first impact was on all professionals. We all immediately went to a remote working environment, and that has presented some challenges, and I think that we'll drill down into them over time. there were also secondary challenges that were posed by contraction in business volume for a lot of institutions. And that then resulted in pay cuts and furloughs and reduction to part-time and all kinds of different impacts on legal professionals. As far as I know, I haven't seen any statistics that specifically break out the impacts on lawyers of color, for example. However, it does stand to reason that because the profession is populated by lawyers of color at the more junior levels, that furloughs and pay cuts and other job consequences of a contraction in business would disproportionately affect them. And so we're on the lookout for those issues, and we at Freddie Mac have very strongly urged our outside counsel not to take those actions if they can avoid them, to really consider this moment to be an investment in the human capital of their firms. And to the extent that they have to take those actions, to really pay close attention to having disproportionate impacts on the diversity community.
Zach, what are you hearing in the public sector?
Well, in the public sector, it is providing to some extent opportunities to reimagine how the workplace functions. When I was corporation counsel, one of the ongoing concerns that members of our non-legal support staff, who are obviously the backbone of our operation of any law firm, and were the people who were the most diverse of our workforce, always lamented the fact that attorneys were given the opportunity to work remotely, but that similarly situated support staff who had functions that could be done at home were not. And now, surprise, surprise, we're learning that everybody can work productively at home. So there's been one thing that's been positive. The other thing is that, and I've been retired since the end of August of last year, and so I have not been engaged in the day-to-day practice of law, but I have been talking to the former colleagues. I can't imagine a time in which having a diverse workplace could be more important, particularly for a law firm, whether it's public or private. I mean, the leadership of law offices, in order to make sense of what's going on in the world, to think about the disparate impact, both in terms of infections and mortality on communities of color, to make sense of the protest and the impact on both employees and families of engagement in those protests. So it seems to me that law firms, public and private, should at this point value more than ever the insights that can be provided by a diverse workplace.
Maria, Ricardo touched on this a little bit already, but when you're talking with your peers at other firms and such, certainly one of the things that people were afraid of was that it was going to be like the Great Recession of 2008, and we were going to see minorities and diverse attorneys being disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. What are you seeing and hearing?
Yeah, no, good question. I think, as Ricardo said, I think it's too soon to tell yet whether there will in fact be a disproportionate impact similar to what we saw happening after the crisis in 2008. I think while it's too soon to tell, what I know from just my own experience and what I'm hearing from my peers is that experience back in 2008 has really informed a lot of the thinking today. So people are more likely to be extra vigilant with respect to their diverse talent, making sure that we don't make the same mistakes that were made 10, 12 years ago. Which I think is a good thing. It's one of the positive things that has come out of this. And I think especially after Mr. Floyd's murder a couple of months ago now, the voices of the communities of color in the law firm world have been significantly amplified, which again, I think bodes well for the likelihood and hopeful, I guess I'm hopeful, we will not be seeing a disproportionate impact on our lawyers of color as a result of what's been happening in the last, the spring of 2020.
Now, Joel, you and I are both old enough, or should I say senior enough, that we lived through the economic downturn of 2008. And one dimension to this discussion that wasn't apparent with that downturn was the personal impact that compounds the professional impact for diverse lawyers. We've seen a disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on Black and Brown communities. Zach has already made some reference to the disparities in access to health care. We've seen a rise in anti-Asian harassment and violence. We've seen socioeconomic disparities really highlighted, especially by those who had the privilege and the ability to work from home. Compare that with those incentivized to take on more dangerous jobs. Let's look forward. So how do you see all of this that's been happening this spring affecting the legal profession's efforts in diversity inclusion going forward?
No, it's a great question. I always tell people in the last year I've gone from arguing against diversity fatigue to scared to death of the impact on minorities and women in our profession as a result of COVID-19 to a ray of hope as a result of the Mr. Floyd murder that we finally hit a tipping point. But like all crises we've had in the United States, we see that minorities and women, there's a disproportionate impact to them. And we all need to be cognizant of that. We know that minorities are adversely impacted from coronavirus more than others, and therefore their level of anxiety is more. And that impacts the home, and therefore it impacts the profession. And there's things that we need to do to recognize that. If we're not taking the time to talk to folks, all folks, but with an emphasis on minorities. How are you? What can I do for you? What's going on in the family? And making these calls that have nothing to do with work and doing that frequently, we're making a mistake. If we're not trying to figure out how we be more inclusive rather than exclusive, there is an interesting issue, right? Will working from home lead to more exclusion or inclusion? On the one hand, you can argue excluded because we don't have the overt actions in the office to have lunch, to socialize, to make sure that we're giving assignments to the right people, to patting people on the back. On the other hand, it's harder to exclude because everybody's in the same predicament, and the jury is out whether this will be more inclusive or exclusive. But we need to make sure that minorities are understanding the HR policies, are being given plum assignments. In-house counsel needs to demand from big law the utilization of minorities and women at all levels. We have to practice better empathy, better listening skills. And Matt, you know me, listening is not my forte. I talk too much. But I'm really spending a lot of time just listening to the stories and the challenges that people have. And then we got to attack anti-Asian racism and racism generally. This is something that we as leaders in our profession have to basically not be silent, because silent is complicity, and that includes microaggressions.
You know, in a world where we're living basically with a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycle, and we have social media, I'm wondering, you know, are any of you seeing any additional adverse effects or impacts that perhaps isn't getting much attention, but nevertheless is affecting the legal profession?
I'll start on that one, Sandra. I think one of the things that we're starting to see more of recently, especially, is in light of the various school districts across the country announcing that they're not going to be reopening. I think that that is having and will continue to have a disproportionate impact on working parents. And unfortunately, a lot of the impact there is falling, based on media reports and based on, conversations with folks around the country, it's looking like it's going to have more of a disproportionate impact on our women, working parents, and also likely end up having a disproportionate impact on our Black and Brown communities. Those communities in particular sometimes have additional family obligations, even if they themselves don't have children. They are, in many cases, the financial breadwinners for extended family. And I think that any type of additional stress that we're seeing in the system right now as a result of, the schools not reopening and related other family obligations, they're going to have an impact on our colleagues' ability to perform at the highest levels that they were expected to be performed. They can't do it all. And so that's another very important issue that I think we all as a profession need to really give some serious consideration to.
Let's dig
Sandra,
into oh, go ahead, Joel.
I'm sorry, just two, and one of them impacts minority women-owned law firms. We know that smaller firms there's a bigger impact on smaller firms. And since several of the smaller firms are minority and women-owned, this is having an unusual impact on minority and women-owned law firms, and we need to be cognizant of that. Secondly, it's having an impact on minorities and women in specialty practices in big law. I got a LinkedIn from a woman of color bankruptcy lawyer a few weeks ago, and she said, I've never seen a call to action about the lack of women and minorities in the bankruptcy restructuring area. And we lost so much after the Great Recession. We cannot afford to have that happen again. So we need to focus on those specialty areas where the numbers were bad to begin with, and the numbers are going to get worse unless we take overt action to rectify that.
The legal media this week has been highlighting headlines about how job turnover is happening suddenly faster, although there may be fewer opportunities in-house. I'm curious from all of you, what effect, if any, do you see this pandemic having on employment opportunities, as well as professional development and career advancement for diverse lawyers?
So I'll start on that one. I think that I was fearing as this pandemic and the crisis were rolling out that we were going to see institutions sort of fall into the comfortable zone of unconscious bias, right? That it's the initiative to improve diversity in recruitment, hiring, development, and advancement really requires a sort of proactive effort. And I was fearful that sort of the apparatus that underlies that proactive effort would tend to kind of dissipate away because it takes energy, it takes time, and I was afraid that it was going to have adverse impacts on hiring. I think that both Maria and Joel alluded to this, but these strong words that have been uttered by corporate organizations, by law firms, have really helped a lot. I think that it really can't understate how inspiring this is to the minority communities around the country, and minority professionals, that when the corporation speaks with a very proactive, definitive, affirmative statement that racism will not be tolerated, that serves to provide that energy, to infuse the institution with the redoubled effort to make sure that diversity in hiring, development, and promotion is not lost. So I'm very encouraged by that. I don't think that it by itself is an answer. It also requires people to redouble their efforts, but I'm not as fearful as I was in May.
Yeah, I think I agree 100% with Ricardo on that. I think we're hearing that all around the country, and as Joel mentioned, he's on a listening tour. So have the corporations and law firms, especially. So I think it's been again a silver lining. The amount of reflection, like genuine, honest reflection that's going on, I think it's terrific, and I think it has the potential to really deliver significant ideas, innovation, different ways of thinking around what is DNI, what does it actually mean? And I think we're moving closer to it being what it actually, most of us on this call, certainly, if not all of us agree, is a business imperative, right? It's not a philanthropic, nice thing to do. It's actually something that is an incredibly important strategic business imperative. And I think we're starting to see that as a result of the conversations and discussions that are happening across the various different institutions.
I'm curious, several of you have touched a little bit on this idea of, working from home, working remotely, the need to still do networking. It's I think, harder to network virtually, isn't it? I mean, are you seeing any particularly creative or innovative networking these days? Anything you think is a particularly poor way to network? What advice do you have for someone who is trying to network virtually now?
Well, the thing that I'm noticing, honestly, is maybe a second order issue. I'm perceiving that the lawyers in my organization are really starting to confront burnout. It's Zoom burnout, really. All the work has to be done on a video conference, and the clients seem to have sort of an insatiable appetite to have meetings versus via Zoom conferences, and so the lawyer's entire day is being soaked up with all of these video conferences. Many of them have childcare responsibilities. They have elder care responsibilities. They're not even getting enough time to actually produce their work product. They don't have downtime from meetings so that they can sit down and work on documents, much less attend to their families. And so we're trying to take some proactive steps to do things like block out a couple of hour segments of the day when the lawyers don't take meetings, so that they can do their work, so they can be with their families. We're also taking some steps to allow people to block their schedules in one direction or another, or split schedules, and even to reduce the number of hours that they're working. And we're going to supplement their efforts with outside counsel resources, or with contract lawyers, or even do some headcount increases so that we can allow people to work fewer hours in order to get their work done. And that includes networking. It includes the time that people need to connect with individuals who are their colleagues within the institution or colleagues at other institutions, and participate in activities like the one we're engaged in right now.
I agree with Rick. I agree with Ricardo, but I'll tell you just a personal observation, because we learn from each other. I haven't been in an airport since March, and when I calculate the number of hours that I spend traveling, whether it's to New York or California or wherever, it's around 20 hours a week. And what I've done is I've taken those 20 hours and I've expanded my mentoring opportunities, and I am reaching out to more people with an emphasis on minorities and women. And that's at HBCU law schools, it's young lawyers, it's senior lawyers that are having issues getting to that next level. So I have found that I am much more prone and better at networking than I've ever been, because when I'm at home, I personally am not in a hurry to turn off and turn on. I don't have that 3-hour-a-day commute. I'm not rushing to my next airplane. So I have been able to do a lot more mentoring as a result of this, and I think that's a good thing. I would challenge every lawyer that's been around for a while, Sandra, you did say that about me early on, that we take the time to mentor people, but we expand who we're mentoring. I am a big proponent of getting out to the HBCU schools and some of the tier 2, tier 3 law schools that are not getting the attention, and helping these kids figure out how to not only survive, but thrive in our profession. And I think we have that as a duty.
This may be an opportunity, when you think about it, to add some structure to mentoring that may have always been needed. Because I remember the first time I heard the word networking, and it came from an African-American lawyer who was talking about how we need to network to produce business. And my reaction was, well, is networking, is that thing that white folks just do, right? That we now have a name for? And when you think about how people tend to gravitate, particularly in the workplace, with folks with whom they're socially comfortable, all right? The norm, I think, for ages has been for people in power, in authority, in legal organizations, to network with, to socialize with people with whom they have an affinity. And that very often operates to exclude people of color. And so if you actually require during this time where our interactions are by Zoom and other technological communications devices, it may be that leadership in law firms have got to say, you Mr. Partner, Mrs. Partner, have an obligation to allocate some of your time to each of the associates to whom you are assigned, not just the ones that you would normally have drinks with on the fly after work.
That's a really good point. But it makes me curious then to ask all of you, you know, we're all at positions in our careers where we have a degree of autonomy. Joel can choose to get on a plane or not get on a plane if he wants. But what about for the younger members in the profession, you know, the law students and newer, younger lawyers who maybe don't have that kind of control over their careers? Any particular suggestions that you would have to offer as support for new law school graduates and young lawyers who are trying to learn to be lawyers?
So I think that there are some lessons in there, and that actually, the question was a great segue from the last discussion. So I think that it's really imperative for junior lawyers and law students to think about these coaching, mentoring, and sponsorship relationships and really to try to cultivate them. It's of course incumbent on us to be open to those and to you know, even seek them out if we can. But this is really going to be the support that junior people in the profession are going to need in order to achieve success. We talked a little bit about the bad old days of the fallout from the Great Recession. But I mean, we need to remember with a little bit more particularity, what happened was that the bottom fell out of opportunity. And there was, you know, 2 or 3 years of law school classes that were virtually lost because of the drop off in the volume of business. And so we need to make sure that we have a net to catch people who are in that situation now, and that we're thinking about how we're going to make opportunities available. At Freddie Mac, we are right now in the process of reinventing the structure of our organization to orient it more towards junior lawyers and looking to the more senior members of our team to do training and transfer of institutional memory to a new cohort of junior lawyers so that we can make opportunities available for more junior people, even though it may not be the most efficient thing in terms of headcount or cost. But we will be able to reap the benefits of it in the long term because we will have some very much needed redundancy as other lawyers start to retire. And we will really be able to give a more junior cohort of lawyers a long-term career opportunity. They'll be able to come into our organization at the junior end of the hierarchy and be able to look forward to 2 or 3 or 4 promotions over the course of their career.
Zach, I wanted to ask you about the concept of privilege, because, you know, lately it seems like the very word is being treated like it's a dirty word in a way. As a profession, are we thinking about the concept of privilege differently now?
I don't know that we're thinking about it as a profession differently now, but we may be beginning to have more of a conversation as a society more broadly about privilege. I mean, when we were having a discussion offline a few weeks ago, we you know, I raised the fact that we've had this confluence of events that not only includes George Floyd and the objective evidence of a disparate impact of the COVID pandemic on people of color, but we also had the so-called Karen incident in Central Park, which revealed that it's not just sheet-wearing bigots who can have attitudes that in stress they may be prepared to weaponize, because that's what that incident in the park was all about. You know, exploiting the belief that that on the part of this particular woman, at least, that the police would respond positively to her and quite negatively to the black man with whom she was having a disagreement. And I think that there's that is frankly a positive lesson, because as long as an educated class of white professionals believe that only, you know, people who attend MAGA rallies are prejudiced. You know, that they are free from the kind of unconscious bias that afflicts most human beings. That's an impediment to progress. And I think that incident, along with the other two, has provided an opportunity for a more open and frank conversation.
Joel, did you want to chime in there?
Yeah, again, learn from my mistakes. After the George Floyd murder, I challenged myself to do 10 things differently tomorrow that I wasn't doing yesterday. And one of them was to get comfortable with the concept of privilege. I learned from Brene Myers about the one step up, one step back. Obviously, I've been a zealot on diversity inclusion for many years, but I was never comfortable talking about privilege because I knew it wasn't a positive, but I was embarrassed to talk about it. So as a result of the George Floyd murder and the confluence of events that Zach talked about, I got very comfortable with it. And I appreciate now that I'm not bragging about it, nor can I be upset about it because there's things that are part of me that I can't control. But it has helped me better proselytize the importance of helping people that are 5 steps behind me because of the color of their skin, their ethnicity, their race, their sexual orientation. It's not affirmative action to bring people up, to give them the opportunities. And by talking about privilege in that way, I think I am much more effective at getting people, again, what Zach is saying, we don't waste our time on the bigots. We're not going to change their mind. But there's a lot of people that want to do the right thing that don't know they're doing the right thing because of unconscious biases. And if you can get them comfortable with the privilege concept, I think we're going to make some dramatic gains with respect to tackling unconscious bias.
You know,
I think, Sandra, if I could just add one other thing to this point on privilege. I think what you're also starting to see is the historical notion of what is a good brief, what is a good oral argument, what is, you know, a decent lawyer, great lawyer. That lens is typical, that identification is typically informed from the perspective of a white heterosexual male. You know, if you are an African-American lawyer and you don't write exactly the way I, white heterosexual male, do, you're not good enough. If you don't argue the way I conduct my arguments, you're not good enough. If you don't write terms of the contract, but I think now what we're starting to see is like, there are multiple different ways. And one of the beauties and the value of diversity is bringing different perspectives, right? Bringing different ways of accomplishing and moving towards, yes, in the case of a negotiation, and moving towards the advancement of whatever the business objective is. And I think that is something that our privilege as professionals is being challenged now. And I think that's good. There are multiple ways of affecting the expected or desired outcome, and it does not always have to be driven by the white heterosexual male perspective.
Let's dig into that a little bit further and follow that line of thought, Maria, to focus now on the future of DNI. You know, certainly in the early parts of the pandemic, I think everybody was afraid that suddenly DNI was going to be a very low priority and that monies and resources were going to dry up. And then George Floyd's murder went viral, as well as Ahmaud Arbery and others. And we saw protests and demonstrations. And suddenly you had law firms and corporate law departments making significant contributions to social justice and social welfare organizations, which is all good. But I'm curious what all of you think as far as how this will impact financial and other kinds of support for the diversity efforts within the legal profession.
I don't think it would necessarily change until there's a greater embrace of what Maria was just talking about,
Right.
About how a positive experience with diverse professionals establishes that there are a lot of different ways of skinning a cat, a lot of different ways of reaching a jury, of arguing a case. You know, when I think about Brown versus Board of Education, obviously Thurgood Marshall was a brilliant legal technician, and his briefs were wonderful But what ultimately got to be the most persuasive thing to the U.S. Supreme Court was the Kenneth Clark study, in which Thurgood Marshall had the brilliance to appreciate the human impact it would have on 9 old elderly white justices to learn that, given a choice, that a little black girl in the 1950s would almost always reject a black doll and embrace a white doll. And 9 old white guys said that was unacceptable. And it was a device that I suspect that someone like Thurgood Marshall would have used more than someone who had not shared that experience, right? And so the more, I mean, frankly, I think that the best remedy for diversity is a lived experience. That's the reason why affirmative action has been important, because when people actually, I mean, one of the reasons why I believe we haven't had a woman as president of the United States and other countries around the world have no problems is that's one of the drawbacks of being a democracy. When you're a monarchy, monarchies from time to time produce queens who have been just as tough and ruthless, you know, and shown great qualities of leadership in times of stress and war. And so when those monarchies were abandoned in favor of democracies, they have freely elected women. We still haven't gotten around to it yet.
So Joel and Maria, is that going to help, hurt, or keep funding support for DNI at the same levels?
You know, it's an interesting question. I can tell you from a NAML perspective, we're going to achieve record numbers in sponsorship, and I would not have said that after COVID-19. I clearly say that after the George Floyd murder, but I will tell you, and we'll talk about it in a few seconds, I love your money because it keeps our beautiful gourmet kitchen open, but I want your words, and then I want your actions, and that's so much more important than the dollars. You know, we do have this ray of optimism, but we are not Pollyannas. But for many of us who've seen this, we've seen diversity inclusion in waves. And anybody that tells you we're successful or not today, I don't think is telling the truth. We won't know that till a year from now. So the money is great, but it's relatively easy to write the check. It's a lot more difficult to implement the systemic and institutional changes we need to combat inequality in the legal profession.
Ricardo and Maria, you're on the funding side. What do you think?
I agree 100% with what Joel is saying, you know, and we've seen my firm and many, many others across the country donating funds to various different organizations that are fighting racial and social justice issues, which is great, wonderful. But for me, as I think about, you know, especially now in my role as Chief Diversity Officer, I want to focus internally. I want to look at our people. Who do we have? What does our pipeline look like? What are the ways in which we can help advance the careers of our women and diverse lawyers? That's my primary focus, and that's, you know, the entire team. What we're focused on right now is, yes, we are contributing. Yes, we are signing up for, you know, as many of you have seen, there's the law firm Anti-Racism Alliance that was established a couple of weeks ago. They just had their summit this week. It looks very promising. It's going to be dealing with a lot of these systemic racism that we have in this country. But while that's wonderful, I applaud it. I wholeheartedly support it. Right now, for me, it's important to look at our people. And what are our demographics, and what's our pipeline, and how we're going to get them from A to B as quickly as possible.
Ricardo, what do you think?
Well, I think the fellow panelists are not going to be surprised to hear me say that the key here is that we who are clients need to drive this process. It's not really as much about making contributions as it is making sure that we require law firms to advance the cause of diversity and inclusion. We require law firms to retain and develop their top talent and advance them within the organization, make sure that the top talent, diverse lawyers, women and minorities become partners. And then after they become partners, they become successful partners. And it's up to us to watch this. We have way more power to influence this by requiring action and accountability than we do by making contributions to to institutions that are doing good things. Contributions are great, but like Joel said, it's requiring the action that's really going to turn the screw and cause this to really become a fact and a reality long-term in our profession.
So Zach, you know, one of the challenges I think the profession has had historically is that a lot of people have tended to always think of D&I as it's philanthropy, it's a hobby, it's something we check the box. Are we going to see a sea change? Is it going to be different and more meaningful somehow? What do you think?
I'm not so much of an optimist that I'm looking for a sea change, but I think that there's the potential for change as people get used to exploiting the diverse talent in their ranks to get deeper insights into this changing world. As a result, again, of the incidents that have focused our attention recently.
You know, Ricardo touched on this a little bit, but you know, just before the pandemic, D&I in the legal profession seemed to be like it was moving beyond some of the more traditional topics we'd gotten used to. We were going beyond allyship, and everybody had done their implicit bias training, and we sort of finished talking about microaggressions. What do you think D&I efforts in the legal profession should look like going forward?
If the goal is to make this successful, and I think Maria said it before, and I think we all agree with this, we have to treat this as a strategic imperative. When I visit corporate legal groups and law firms, and they tell me that diversity, equality, inclusion is treated as the same level as any other strategic imperative, and that means a mission statement, vision, accountability, goals, metrics. I am a carrots and sticks person. We've seen too many carrots without sticks. We have got to, and Ricardo mentioned it, we have got to give law firms more business that are doing what we want and take business away from law firms that aren't doing what we want. I think Maria would love that. But we can't just have them fill out a survey and put it in a drawer and check the box. We have to tie compensation to individuals' efforts with respect to diversity and inclusion. We have to tie promotions into that. In a nutshell, you've got to treat this like a strategic imperative, and very few law firms and corporations historically have done it at that level. The other thing is, when you can judge a law firm or corporation with their D&I program that works as well during bad economic times as good economic times, they have something different and they should be emulating. Because what we've seen historically is every time the economy tanks, the programs stop and the metrics take 3 steps backwards. We cannot afford to be in that position again today.
So are there some positive outcomes for D&I in the aftermath of COVID-19?
I think picking up on what Joel just said, I think the positive is that more corporations, general counsels like Ricardo are coming to law firms and saying, you know, okay, I know we've been talking about this for the last 30 years. I know we've been asking you for all kinds of data over the last 20 years. And I know you've been providing every year all kinds of, you know, statistics and information and everything else, but nothing has, relatively speaking, there's been very little progress. And there's never, for the most part, it's usually the case that the corporation will say, okay, we'll come back next year, we'll, you know, revisit, have this conversation again. But to Joel's point, if there's no stick, if there's no other incentive to affect change, what's happening in the law firm world is that, you know, law firms are saying, you know what, the clients have been saying this for so many years, they don't do anything, right? So then you're getting to the point where firms are saying, well, if the clients aren't going to care, you know, I'm happy to continue giving them data. If they're not going to do anything with it and they're not going to have consequences, you know, then what are we talking about? So, you know, it is, I think, more likely than not, I hope at least, that you're going to start seeing more corporations have meaningful conversations around what clear expectations they have of their outside counsel and what clear consequences for the failure to meet those expectations they're going to have. Because I think unless that piece is added to the equation, we're going to continue to have, you know, just regular to, you know, slow progress. So I'm hopeful that now that you are having a bit of a sea change, around DNI, the conversations that are happening across the country on race, which is something that companies and law firms especially have always, or I guess never really had, at least certainly not to my knowledge. That's, I think, a tremendous step forward. And if you couple that with clear consequences for failure to meet expectations, I think that's great. Asking for more data, which is, by the way, something that I've seen in the last 10 years. You know, it used to be just this type of data. Now it's this. Now you're looking at, you know, what law schools am I going to? What, you know, that for what? What are you doing with that? If your goal is to see more diversity on your matters, and your goal is to see more women and diverse lawyers leading your projects and you know, filling first chair roles, then that's, I think, what you should be focused on in terms of data, and not all this other stuff. Because while we're happy to give it to you, to what end, right?
Exactly.
Zach,
The original purpose of the data was to give general counsels a stick that they would use as a way of taking business away from clients or from firms that didn't actually achieve whatever the general counsel decided was going to be the objective. One problem is that that stick has been used very, very seldom. So it's not a real threat to the mass of the law firms. The other problem is that the data themselves are a very crude instrument, as you say, Maria. They're a very crude instrument for approximating what the real goal is. The real goal is to see, as you say, diverse teams working on our matters. But even more importantly, from my point of view, it's to see diversity in the leadership of the firm. We want to see the profession become more diverse. If working on our matters helps the firm become more diverse, that's great. But if what we're doing is really just, if we're just poaching diverse lawyers away from other clients, we haven't moved the ball. Really, all the general counsels, all the corporate clients need to get focused on this and realize that in order to move diversity in the profession, we all need to be moving down the same playing field, and we all need to hold the leadership of the firms accountable, not just for the diversity of our teams, but for the diversity of the entire firm. And that needs to be the stick. If you can't advance according to a plan towards that objective, we take our business away from you, because there are lots of firms that will do it.
Zach, I'm curious to get your thoughts on something. When we'd been talking earlier, you were also discussing that there's another impact that maybe we haven't focused on much as a profession, which is young people. They seem to have been galvanized this spring. Can you tell us more about what you're thinking?
Well, in the profession, I mean, I you know, particularly during the latter years of my my practice, I'd be called upon very often by groups of young lawyers, to be a guest speaker, to talk about finding their way in the early part of their careers. And particularly when I talk to affinity groups of diverse young lawyers, there would be a lot of discussion and debate around whether young lawyers entering the workforce should tiptoe through their first years in the profession, whether they should speak up when they believe that there's an issue on which they need to be heard that may have a significant impact on the diverse group from which they are drawn, or more generally. And the advice that many of these youngsters get is to, be quiet, do your work, get to that partnership, become a senior associate, and then, you can feel freer to to express yourself. And I've always felt the opposite. I've always felt that if you are in the room when an issue is being debated and it affects a community of color to which you belong, and something is being said, a view is being expressed that you consider to be inappropriate, that your failure to speak up at that point is an occasion for you to lose respect, because most people would expect that if that issue came up and you're a member of this class, that that if you have any kind of inner principle, that you would speak up and be heard. So that's but I'm going to follow up on a point that Ricardo and Maria have made, and I know that everyone on this panel believes that diversity is not an act of charity for diverse people, but that actually improves the quality of the law firms and corporate counsel offices that we're talking about. But we have got to accept the challenge of more particularly articulating the case for why diversity adds value. I think all of us may have had occasions on which the presence of a diverse lawyer on a team made a real difference. And we have to collect and repeat those stories as often as we can, because otherwise we are demanding of firms to meet arbitrary statistical standards. I want you to have X number of attorneys. I want the team representing our business to be populated with, with a woman, with a Black, with a Latino, with Asian, and not articulating the reason why I think I will get better service if the team looks that way. I remember when I was U.S. attorney, I was deciding how to organize our violent gang function. And we already had in the Eastern District of New York a really aggressive group of attorneys who were dealing with Asian street gangs. And when I decided to form this separate unit to deal with inner city crack gangs, I decided to leave the Asian crime unit separate, because I didn't want because that was the really prestige investigations. I didn't want all the air sucked out of the room for my new initiative. And so I already had a press conference set up, press release, the whole bit to announce this. And an Asian American assistant U.S. attorney came into my office, asked to see me, and said, my community is about to hear you announce that you're going to go after aggressive, non-traditional organized crime groups preying on inner city communities. And you're describing an Asian street gang. How can you do that? And I changed my mind on the spot. We changed the press release, the whole bit, and it made a huge difference. But two things had to happen. She had to be there, and she had to be prepared to speak up.
We've only got a little bit of time left, and so I want to make sure that we have a chance to get to some of the questions that our audience is posing. So let me start with this one. How do we ensure that the symbolic talk about Black Lives Matter, et cetera, how do we make sure that it gets translated into measurable and sustained action for which firms will be held accountable?
I think one of the ways is to embrace the fact that the Black Lives Matter is a movement, not a moment in time, right? I think that's going to be the key. I think it's all this energy, all this momentum, all this passion around doing better as a society, and certainly as individual institutions and as individuals, that's sustained, because I think that is what's driving and influencing a lot of the action items that various institutions are taking. A lot of programming, a lot of initiatives focused on doing better. And I think if we think of this moment, if we think of this time as just a moment, and 3 months from now, 6 months from now, no one cares, no one's talking about it, no one's advancing it, then we've lost. So I think, having a long-term perspective on what's coming out of this particular moment in time is going to be hugely helpful in keeping it current and keeping it fresh and keeping it top of mind.
Here's another interesting. Oh, go ahead.
No, the other thing I would add, and again, it's not from a law firm perspective, it's from an individual perspective. again, after the George Floyd murder, I challenged myself and I challenged everybody to do 10 things differently. So I am listening to people. I am reaching out to HBCU schools. I am not allowing microaggressions to occur. I am never being silenced anymore when I say things that are wrong. I just think we all have to do things differently. Every morning I wake up and I go, Black Lives Matter. And I didn't do that 3 months ago. I thought so, I understood it. But what can I do to make today better as a result of saying that? And if close your eyes and picture if we in our profession all did that, just pick 3 things, we would change the world in which we live in. And we're not, as a mass, doing that today. We need to do that.
We have another question where our viewer is asking about this conversation taking place and excluding Black women, that, you know, we're not an entirely diverse panel. And the viewer also notes that, you know, it's very kindly that all of us appear to be at least over 40, more than 40.
I take exception to that.
Right.
How does this reflect a diverse conversation when we don't have any Black women on this panel?
There are cases. Listen, I understand exactly where the questioner is coming from, and here's the problem with diversity, particularly when you're talking about a limited number of positions or one position. There can only be one mayor at a time. There can only be one president at a time. All right. So sometimes diversity has to be in turns. Now, if the city bar were to have a series of 5 panels and there was never a Black woman on it, that would be a problem. But if on the very next panel, we make up for the fact that there was no Black woman, or frankly, a Muslim American, all right, but who have unique challenges in the workplace, I think that the judging whether or not the city bar is approaching this correctly in terms of diversity has to be judged over time, not just on a single panel. But I think this point is well taken.
Yeah, and I'll just add that my understanding, I know it's certainly the case at our firm, the profession has finally realized that for many years, the intersection between racial and ethnic diversity initiatives and initiatives focused on women have excluded the women of color, right? And I think that is reflected in our statistics. If you look at the now numbers across the country, women of color, you know, to Ricardo's point in leadership, Black women represent, off the top of my head, about 0.7% of partners in major law firms. Latina women 0.6, Asian women 0.9. Those numbers have really caught the attention of the management at big law. So there's a big push happening across the country, I believe, to focus more on women of color. And I'm hopeful that those initiatives are going to yield some results very soon so that you start seeing some significant improvement on the representation of partnerships and law firms of women of color. So there's hope for the future to our questioner.
Okay, we're really running down on time, so 1 minute, and I need one of you to answer this question. Do you have any advice for foreign trained attorneys, for someone who is dual qualified in New York and another country, was exempted from having to do an LLM prior to sitting for the New York bar?
I assume a lawyer who's would be considered a lawyer of color and looking for.
Doesn't say.
Doesn't say. Well, I mean, the topic is diversity. I think that just as a matter of a principled statement, being foreign doesn't necessarily make you diverse. And so, you know, our purpose here is really to redress an injustice in our country. And, a lawyer of color who's become an American of color obviously should be able to draw on all the resources that we've been talking about. And that is something that you should do. If you would like to talk about being a non-US lawyer looking for opportunities in the US, get in touch with me. I used to run the stagiaire program at Cleary Gottlieb, and I have lots of advice for non-US lawyers who are looking for opportunities in the US.
Great. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have, and we have been instructed we need to conclude promptly at 5 o'clock. So please let me thank all of our panelists for their time and wisdom, the planning committee, and all of you who chose to take time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.